Apollo 13 didn't die in space. It died on the ground, weeks before it launched. Everyone remembers the explosion, 250,000 miles from Earth, an oxygen tank tearing open in the dark. Almost no one remembers what really killed it, a switch the size of your fingernail, a wrong number that nobody caught. Together they sealed the fate of 3 men before the rocket ever left the pad. This isn't a story about bad luck. It's the story of a machine that was built to fail, and of 3 astronauts who survived it with duct tape, a cardboard cover, and a lifeboat that was never meant to keep anyone alive. So, here is the question this whole story turns on. What actually doomed Apollo 13? And once it was doomed, why did the fix, the desperate, improvised, held together with tape fix, work at all? Because the honest answer to both is the same answer, and it is not the one you were told. In April of 1970, America was already bored with the moon. Apollo 11 had landed. Apollo 12 had landed again. A third crew walking on another world barely made the evening news. Apollo 13 was supposed to be routine. That word, routine, is the first thing that should scare you. There was one eerie coincidence the crew waved off at the time. The mission was numbered 13. It lifted off at 13 minutes past the 13th hour, Houston time. Lovell, a practical man, laughed at the superstition. Years later, after everything, he admitted he wasn't quite so sure anymore. The commander was Jim Lovell, and for him this one was personal. 2 years earlier, on Apollo 8, Lovell had flown all the way around the moon and watched it drift past his window, close enough to name the craters, without ever touching it. Apollo 13 was his last chance to walk on it. Beside him were 2 rookies, Fred Haise and the command module pilot, Jack Swigert. But Swigert almost wasn't there at all. He had been the backup. 2 days before launch, the original pilot, Ken Matting Lee, was pulled from the crew. A backup astronaut had been exposed to German measles, and Matting Lee had no immunity. NASA didn't want a sick pilot 250,000 miles from a hospital, so they swapped him out. Remember Matting Lee. He is about to matter more than anyone in this story, from the wrong side of the glass. Now go back. Not days before launch. Years. Because the tank that would one day explode had already been damaged, and nobody flying that mission knew it. In the autumn of 1968, this exact oxygen tank was being removed from a different spacecraft. A bolt in the hoist failed. The shelf holding the tank dropped, only about 2 inches, a fall shorter than the width of your hand. Engineers inspected it, decided the odds of real damage were low, and cleared it to fly. It was the wrong call. A small internal fill line inside that tank had been knocked loose. And a loose part you cannot see is the most dangerous kind. On paper, everything looked fine. The tank was checked, judged good enough, signed off, and bolted into Apollo 13. But that damaged drain line is exactly why months later the tank would refuse to empty on the launch pad, and why engineers would reach for the heaters that finished the job of dooming it. A single overlooked part, and a single word: acceptable. So the seed of the disaster was already inside Apollo 13, the day it rolled to the launch pad. It was planted not by the cosmos, but by a dropped shelf and a shrug. Hold on to that, because the cosmos gets all the blame for what happened next, and the cosmos is innocent. Guardan tanker dedono subiram. On Assange, here is where the fingernail switch comes in. Here is the wrong number. This is the part almost every telling of Apollo 13 skips, and it is the part that matters most. That damaged tank had one more problem. During a routine test on the launch pad, it refused to empty the way it should. So the team ran the tank's internal heaters to boil the oxygen out. For hours. Not minutes. The better part of a full working day, the heaters cycling on and off, while the stubborn tank slowly gave up its load. Inside the tank were tiny thermostatic switches, meant to cut the heaters off if things got too hot. And here is the paperwork failure, hiding underneath the electrical one. Years earlier, the spacecraft's ground power had been raised from 28 volts to 65. That change reached almost everyone who needed it. It never reached the small company that built those thermostatic switches. So the switches stayed rated for a spacecraft that no longer existed, built to handle the ship's own 28 volts. But the ground equipment on the pad ran at 65, more than twice what those little switches were ever designed to survive. So when the moment came for the switches to open and cut the heat, they couldn't. The higher voltage welded their contacts shut. The heaters kept running, and the temperature inside that tank may have climbed toward 1,000 degrees. Here is the cruelest detail of all. The gauge that was supposed to warn everyone physically could not read higher than 85 degrees. A furnace was burning inside the tank, and the thermometer was stuck on warm. The heat did what heat does. It cooked the thin plastic insulation off the wiring inside the tank, leaving bare, exposed wire wrapped around a bomb of pure liquid oxygen. No one on Earth saw it. No one on the crew knew. Apollo 13 launched anyway, carrying a short circuit waiting for a spark. That is the tiny switch that doomed the mission. And this is the Apollo 13 failure nobody put in the movie. Launch itself went nearly perfectly, which is exactly what a doomed ship is supposed to do. For 2 days, Apollo 13 was exactly the boring mission everyone expected. The crew did a television broadcast from space, and not a single network carried it live. America wasn't watching. 3 men were sailing toward the moon, and the world had already changed the channel. Then, 55 hours and 54 minutes into the flight, Mission Control asked the crew to do something completely ordinary. Stir the oxygen tanks, a routine flip of a switch to keep the contents from settling. Jack Estweigert reached over and flipped it, and the spark found the bare wire. Bang! The whole spacecraft shuddered. For 1.5 seconds, Mission Control lost all data from the ship. Less time than a single breath, and the beginning of everything. Then Estweigert's voice came down, steady and almost polite. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Listen to that line again."
Okay,
Not "we have a problem."
This is Houston, say again.
We've had a problem. Past tense. Whatever had gone wrong was already done. Lovell repeated it a moment later, and that phrasing, the calm, past tense phrasing of men who don't yet know how bad it is the real transmission. The famous movie line is a rewrite. The truth is quieter and worse. Duckersum, Gerbanker. Because within minutes, it got much worse. The explosion had blown an entire panel off the side of the service module. It had destroyed the damaged oxygen tank instantly, and cracked the second one, which now began to bleed its oxygen into space through a wound the crew couldn't see. On the ground, controllers had heard Lovell report a main B bus undervolt. Dry, technical words that meant the ship was losing its electrical lifeblood.
Roger, main B undervolt.
At first, everyone hoped it was a faulty sensor, a glitch. Then Lovell looked out the window and saw it. A thin cloud of gas venting into the blackness. The ship quietly breathing its own oxygen out into space. That was the moment the moon landing died, and a new, smaller mission took its place. Just get them home. For Lovell, something more private died in that same instant. The moon he had chased his whole life, and circled once already, slipped away for the last time. He would never get another shot at it. But that grief had to wait. There were 3 lives to hold on to now, and one of them was his own. And oxygen wasn't only for breathing. The command module made its electricity and its drinking water by combining oxygen and hydrogen in fuel cells. As the oxygen drained away, those fuel cells starved and died one by one. The crew watched their ship's power, water, and air all fall towards zero on the same gauges. Their spacecraft, named Haise, was becoming a cold, dark, dead shell around them. Roughly 200,000 miles from home, Lovell, SWY, and Haise faced a fact no crew had ever faced. The ship built to bring them back to Earth could no longer keep them alive long enough to try. They had to abandon it and move into the one part of the spacecraft that still had a heartbeat. That part was the lunar module. Its name was Haise. It was a fragile, spidery machine built for one single job, carrying 2 men down to the moon's surface and back up. It was designed to support 2 people for about 45 hours. Now it had to keep 3 people alive for around 90 hours. Twice the crew, twice the time it was ever meant to give. A lifeboat rated for 2, with 3 men climbing aboard for 4 days in deep space. It should not have been enough. It was all they had, and here is the first twist that turns this from a tragedy into something stranger. The lifeboat was only there at all because they were still on their way to the moon. If that oxygen tank had waited just 2 more days to explode, on the trip home, after the lunar module had already been cast away, there would have been no Haise to climb into. The very timing that nearly killed them was also the only reason they had any chance to live. The mission was doomed by a machine. It was saved in part by an accident of the clock. But a lifeboat with no engine plan is just a slower way to die. Apollo 13 was still racing toward the moon, not toward Earth. The crew and mission control had to turn the whole spacecraft around using the one engine they still trusted, the small descent engine on the lunar module, the one built to land on the moon, now used to sling them home. Think about what that means. An engine designed to gently lower 2 men onto lunar dust was now being asked to shove the entire crippled stack across space like a tugboat. A job it was never built for, that no one had ever rehearsed. Their first move came only about 5 hours after the bang. A short 35-second burn to nudge Apollo 13 back onto what's called a free return path. The kind of path that loops around the moon and lets gravity alone fling the ship home, even with the main engines cold and dead. It bought them the option to survive. It did not yet buy them the time. First, they used the moon itself, swinging around its far side to bend their path back toward Earth. Then, on the other side, they lit that little engine for a long, tense burn of about 264 seconds, roughly 4.5 minutes, to speed up their return by nearly 9 hours. 9 hours they did not have in oxygen, or power, or water. That same burn also dragged their landing point halfway across the planet, out of the Indian Ocean and into the South Pacific, forcing the recovery fleet to sprint to a whole new patch of sea, and they flew that burn by hand. The navigation computer they'd normally trust was powered down to save its batteries. So Jim Lovell held the entire spacecraft steady the old way, by eye, keeping the line where Earth's day met its night lined up in his tiny window, while the engine pushed and 3 lives balanced on how still he could hold it. No autopilot, no second chances, just a man, a window, and the edge of his own planet as a guide. Now the danger changed shape. It stopped being an explosion and became something slower, and in some ways crueler. To save every scrap of power for the trip home, They shut almost everything off. The cabin temperature fell to around 38 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above freezing. Water beaded on the cold walls. The men couldn't sleep in the wet chill. Water itself became rationed to about 6 ounces a day per man, roughly a third of a cup, a fifth of what they needed. The crew slowly dried out. Over those days, the 3 of them lost nearly 32 pounds of body weight between them, Lovell alone shedding 14. Their own bodies were being spent to buy time. Food became almost pointless. Most of it needed hot water they couldn't spare, and what they had was cold and unappetizing in a cabin near freezing. So they mostly stopped eating. Picture it plainly. 3 exhausted, dehydrated, half-starved men circling the far side of the moon in the dark and the cold, trying not to fall too deeply asleep. Because sleep meant shivering. And shivering burned the very energy they had no way to replace. And it was Fred Haise who broke first. Not the machine. The man. Dehydrated and freezing, he developed a painful urinary infection and ran a fever for the trip home. It's a detail worth sitting with. We picture spaceflight as a battle of engineering. But out there in the cold and the dark, the human body reached its limit before the failing spacecraft reached its own. Then a new number started to climb. One that could kill them faster than the cold. Carbon dioxide. 3 men breathing inside a lifeboat built for 2 were exhaling more poison than its filters could scrub. The air was slowly turning toxic, and here the machine's design tried to murder them one more time. The command module had spare filters, but they were square. The lunar module's slots were round. The parts that could save their air physically would not fit together. A square peg, a round hole, and a rising tide of carbon dioxide. Left unchecked, that gas climbs toward levels that first cloud your thinking, then dim your vision, then simply put you to sleep for good. The crew were, slowly, being poisoned by their own breath. So on the ground, engineers dumped onto a table exactly what the crew had aboard, and nothing more, and invented a fix out of garbage. The crew followed step by step, building an adapter from the cover of a flight manual, plastic bags, the hose from a spacesuit, a sock stuffed in to block a leak, and a great deal of gray duct tape. They called it the mailbox, and that ugly, taped-together contraption drove the carbon dioxide back down to safe levels and held it there all the way home. Remember what doomed them: precision, a voltage, a tolerance, a specification. Remember what saved them: a sock and some tape. There was still one impossible problem left. To survive re-entry, the crew would have to wake their dead command module back up, restart a frozen ship on almost no battery power, in an order no one had ever needed before. No such procedure existed. It had to be written from nothing in about 3 days, and it had to be perfect. And the man who led that effort was Ken Mattingly, the pilot who had been pulled from the crew 2 days before launch over a case of measles he never even caught. From the ground in a simulator, the astronaut left behind wrote the checklist that would bring the others back. The mission had discarded him. Now his rejection was the crew's lifeline. When the crew finally ran his procedure, and Odysseus' lights flickered back to life on the ragged edge of its batteries, it worked. Every switch, in every order exactly as written. The ship that had nearly become their coffin was ready, barely, to be their shield. And here's one more myth worth clearing away. You may know the line, "Failure is not an option," barked by the flight director in the film. He never actually said it. A screenwriter put those words in his mouth years afterward. The real control room had no slogans. It was quieter than that and more frightening. Just tired people doing math against a clock, refusing to look away. They had survived the explosion, the cold and the slow poison. Now came the one barrier that could still kill them in a matter of seconds. Just before re-entry, they cast off the ruined service module, and for the first time, saw what had almost killed them. Lovell looked out and said, "There's one whole side of that spacecraft missing." An entire panel blown out from near the engine laid open to space. They had been flying beside that wound for days without seeing it. Then came re-entry, and the worst weight of all. As any capsule tears into the atmosphere, a sheath of superheated air cuts off all radio contact. Mission Control expected that blackout to last a few minutes. It stretched about a minute and a half longer than it should have. And in that extra silence, everyone on the ground had the same thought. The explosion might have damaged the heat shield, and if it had, there would be nothing to hear, ever again. In Mission Control, the clock ticked past the second they should have heard a voice. 10 seconds of silence. 20. 30. Flight controllers who had not slept in days sat frozen at their consoles, every one of them running the same grim arithmetic, and none of them saying it out loud. There was another cruelty waiting even here. A tropical storm had moved into the planned landing zone, forcing controllers to shift the whole splashdown point at the last stretch. So the crew was coming home to a moving target, through a silence that ran too long, in a ship patched together by a man they'd left on the ground. "Ma'am, psychosis dear vernabarus resourcum." And then, 3 parachutes. On the 17th of April, 1970, Apollo 13 splashed down in the South Pacific, near the recovery ship. The mission had lasted a little under 143 hours. Lovell, SWI Gert, and Haise walked out alive, every one of them. And here is the quiet irony that closes the circle. Remember that television broadcast 3 days earlier, the one no network bothered to carry, because America had grown bored of men going to the moon. Now, as the capsule fell toward the sea, the entire planet stopped and watched. Nations that agreed on nothing prayed for the same 3 men. The mission the world had ignored at launch had become the story everyone on Earth was holding their breath for. The world called it a successful failure and left it there. A feel-good ending. Bad luck, good teamwork, roll credits. But that phrase is a lie of omission, and this is where I refuse to hand it to you clean, because the truth is sharper and it's the whole point. Apollo 13 was not unlucky. Go back through it. A tank dropped and cleared to fly. A voltage nobody double-checked. A switch that welded shut. A gauge that couldn't see its own furnace. None of those alone would have killed anyone. It was the combination, a chain of small, ordinary mistakes riding on top of a design that could not forgive a single one of them. The official review board said exactly that. It was not chance. It was a system that had quietly agreed to fail, and it balanced on the thinnest edges. If the tank had exploded just 2 days later on the way home, the lunar module would already have been gone, and with it any chance of a lifeboat. If it had held together a few days longer and blown near the moon's surface, the story ends in silence. The same razor-thin timing that made the disaster survivable is what made it a disaster at all. Not luck. Margins, measured in hours and in inches, and that is the strange symmetry at the heart of Apollo 13. The mission was doomed by precision, by all the careful specifications and tolerances and procedures that let one welded switch slip through. And it was saved by improvisation, by a sock, a manual cover, and a lifeboat used against its own rulebook. The rigor is what nearly killed them. The garbage is what brought them home. And it took an army to do it. Thousands of people on the ground spent 4 sleepless days turning a catastrophe into a rescue, building fixes that had never existed for a situation no one had ever trained for, against a countdown they couldn't stop. The crew survived because, on the ground and in the ship, no one accepted the mistake as final. Jim Lovell, the man the moon turned away twice, who then held his dying ship steady by the edge of the earth to save the crew it never let him land, died in the summer of 2025 at 97. Fred Haise is now the last of the 3 still with us, the last man who was actually there, which means the story of Apollo 13 is passing, right now, out of living memory and into history. So it's worth getting it right. It didn't die in space. It died on the ground. And it was saved by 3 men, and everyone below them, who refused to let a machine's mistake become their own. That's not a story about luck. It never was. That's as far as this one goes, but the edge always moves. This is a Philo. Subscribe, drop a like if it earned it, and your next one's on screen now. I'll meet you a little further out.